Throughout history, wherever there is power, corruption tends to thrive, and elections have often been a breeding ground for widespread fraud. Even in countries like the UK and the US, which are often seen as models, both have spent a long time struggling with these issues. The political polarization we see today is simply the inevitable result of internal developments. In the early stages of democratic elections, tricks such as ballot box stuffing and creating invalid ballots were common. There were even brazen attempts to manipulate public opinion with money and bullets. This situation began in Britain after the Industrial Revolution, when the rapid demand for workers in manufacturing led to the rise of a new urban class. The division between the bourgeoisie and the working class began to take shape during this unique period. Although these groups were sharply opposed, both were eager to expand their political power. Unfortunately, the British electoral system still favored the landowning gentry and was hostile to these emerging new forces. The first flaw was that constituencies were still based on the medieval system of self-governing cities. As industrialization grew, many of these cities had declined by the 18th century. For example, Old Sarum in southern England, which had originally developed around a church, saw its population move to nearby industrial towns like Salisbury or the port city of Southampton by the 19th century. Despite this, Old Sarum still held 2 seats in Parliament, with a population of only 3 households and 7 voters. As a result, it was often controlled by the nobility or sold to the highest bidder. These so-called zombie constituencies were commonly known as rotten boroughs. Another flaw was the very limited voter base. The law stipulated that only free men earning 40 shillings or more annually could vote, effectively excluding poor farmers and factory workers. For example, the third largest city in England, Birmingham, had a population of 80,000, yet only 399 people were eligible to vote. With such a small electorate, political manipulation was remarkably easy. Politicians could bribe urban voters directly or intimidate farmers who rented land from local landowners. Since voting was often public, these manipulative tactics came at almost no cost. As time passed, 2 major revolutions on the European continent influenced Britain, sparking a gradual push for reform. After the July Revolution in France in 1830, Britain passed the Reform Act of 1832. This act not only redrew constituency boundaries, but also merged several notorious rotten boroughs into neighboring counties. It also lowered the voting threshold, granting voting rights to 1/5 of adult men nationwide. However, many critics still raised concerns, arguing that unless voters themselves were honest and incorruptible, expanding the electorate would only lead to more corrupt voters. In fact, such concerns were entirely predictable. Electoral fraud in the UK continued to increase after 1832, reaching its most rampant phase by the mid-19th century. In the 1868 general election, political parties competed to distribute allowances to voters, spending nearly £500,000. The official reason was to compensate for lost wages, but the real intent was all too clear. In the 1880 election, with nearly all adult men eligible to vote, the costs of election bribery skyrocketed to an unprecedented £3 million. Both the Conservative and Liberal parties employed close to 1,000 propagandists and heavily distributed voter allowances. Perhaps because the election had become so disreputable, Parliament finally could not ignore the need for reform. In response, the Representation of the People Act of 1872 was passed, changing voting from a public to a secret ballot. This measure at least made it harder for manipulators to determine whether voters were casting their ballots as they wished, making it more difficult to bribe or intimidate them. In 1883, the UK passed the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Prevention Act, which set spending limits for each election. For constituencies with 2,000 voters, the spending cap was £710. For every additional 1,000 voters, the limit increased by £40. Furthermore, each candidate was allowed to hire only one agent to assist with campaigning and was required to submit detailed accounts to prove they had not exceeded the spending cap. The effects of this legislation were significant, with election spending dropping to £500,000 for the 1885 general election. After a series of reforms, systematic electoral manipulation in the UK was largely curtailed. However, in many local elections, some corrupt practices continued to thrive. As late as 1990, the London MP Shirley Porter scandal came to light. The Conservative MP used public housing in her constituency to strategically sell properties to her supporters. These individuals could then register as voters in specific areas, effectively reversing the voting margin between constituencies and ensuring a Conservative victory in the 1990 election. However, Porter's scheme was quickly uncovered, and she was forced to flee to Israel. This incident demonstrates that even with a well-established legal system, it is sometimes difficult to entirely eliminate electoral fraud. Of course, Shirley Porter's trick was not her own invention, and its inspiration came from across the Atlantic in the United States. This strategy is known as gerrymandering, which involves manipulating electoral district boundaries to concentrate opposition voters in a few districts, ensuring that the party controlling the redistricting wins the majority of the districts. The term gerrymandering originated in Massachusetts in 1814. At that time, Governor Elbridge Gerry deliberately redrew electoral districts to ensure a victory for his Democratic-Republican Party in the state elections. Since one of the new districts resembled a salamander, the tactic became known as gerrymandering. Before 1884, the United States faced similar election chaos to that of the UK. While early America did not have property-based restrictions on voters and large-scale corrupt manipulation of constituencies was rare, the overall level of disorder was no less than in Britain. It wasn't until 1884 that the Australian ballot was gradually introduced, requiring ballots to be printed and distributed by public institutions, ensuring voter anonymity. In other words, before this reform, American ballots were not printed by public authorities. Instead, political parties themselves printed the ballots, listing presidential candidates, vice presidential candidates, congressional representatives, governors, and other offices, which voters would take to the polling stations to cast their votes. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name was not on the ballot in the South because local power brokers had intentionally excluded it. Such a blatant tactic easily revealed voters' political leanings to others. As a result, many polling stations turned into battlegrounds, places rife with violence and bribery. Since persuasion rarely swayed anyone's opinion, supporters of both parties resorted to physical altercations, using force to intimidate voters who didn't support their side. Those who tried to challenge the situation were often targeted by the opposing faction. For instance, in New England during the 1850s, reformers proposed offering envelopes to all voters, but the proposal was never passed. At the same time, in the more conservative South, the practice of oral voting still persisted. The process typically involved villagers gathering in an open area under the supervision of the police, where the sheriff would loudly ask each voter whom they supported. It's easy to see that, under such a system, minorities had almost no chance of expressing their true intentions. However, due to tradition and established practices, this method remained in use in certain southern states until it was finally abolished in 1891. In 1876, the chaos of the U.S. election system reached its peak. The Civil War had only recently ended, and tensions between the Democratic and Republican parties were escalating, with many fearing a second civil war. In the South, where conservatives held sway, Democrats took action to prevent black people from voting, even resorting to the Ku Klux Klan to commit acts of violence. On the other side, Republicans deployed federal troops to protect black voters, ensuring they could reach polling stations, and even allowed some to vote multiple times. When the votes were counted, Both parties claimed victory in several southern states, and Florida presented 3 different sets of election results. In the end, the dispute was handed over to Congress, which ultimately decided the fate of the contested electoral votes, bringing the farce to an end. Starting in 1888, the United States introduced a secret ballot system, which significantly reduced bribery and the use of violence to influence elections. By 1896, this system had spread to 90% of the states. However, government-controlled voting agencies provided a new avenue for manipulation. They set requirements for candidates to appear on the ballot, effectively eliminating most minor parties and turning elections into a 2-party contest between the Democrats and Republicans. Another tactic commonly used in the South was literacy tests, which were designed to prevent Black Americans from voting. No matter how fair the election process was, if they couldn't cast a ballot, it was all for nothing. The so-called literacy tests were particularly discriminatory. Given the lower educational levels of many Black Americans at the time, few could pass the tests, and even those who were educated often couldn't answer the strange and difficult questions posed. Due to the nation's racial issues, it took nearly a century longer for the United States to achieve fair voting compared to Britain. It wasn't until the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that a relatively equal and fair election system was established across the nation. However, the U.S. election system still has many flaws, and election scandals continue to emerge, indicating that further reforms are needed in the future.